What is going on, y'all? KMB here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I think the easiest place to start for this metagame is going to be the Skaar deck, which has a very low gap between what low-skilled and high-skilled players can do with it. Sort of a reverse of the dynamic that Move Bounce had. I think this deck is going to be the easiest good deck for a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience to pick up and play, because ultimately it's really straightforward in terms of what your game actions are. That's on rails. And so the only thing you really have to focus on is point allocation, especially at the end of the game, and snapping, which means that you can focus on basically your fundamentals here when you play this deck, because there is not a lot of inbuilt domain knowledge required in order to understand and execute on this deck's game plan. You are interested in playing the card Surtur, and then you are interested in playing cards that say 10 on them, and then you are interested in playing a Skaar that costs 0. That's the deck, and like intricate stuff still does happen here. You have a lot of different ways to play counterplay when you have priority on the final turn of the game. There's a lot of intricate little bits to this deck in the sense of like, oh, well, I need to be winning this lane to play my crossbones, or, oh, you know, I've got salmon here for Call Obsidian. But like, if we're being real, like really, really real, you should not have to think very hard to play this deck. You should understand what the goal of this deck is, and you should not struggle with any of the technical bits. This is a very straightforward, very powerful deck that outputs a lot of points on good draws, has very clear snap and retreat options, and has a lot of inbuilt counterplay to things people are going to try to do to beat you, like Cosmo and Armor. Some people may ask, why is Psylocke in here instead of Iron Patriot? Put simply, Iron Patriot just was not triggering for me ever. It just wasn't a thing that was going to be what I wanted to do. The only times it would go off were when my opponent would just abandon the lane because they didn't realize I was a Skaar deck, and they were like, oh, okay, that's probably a good thing to not contest. I have long been a little suspicious of Iron Patriot in decks like this, and so the Psylocke is here effectively as a second version of Surtur. I'm never going to get that right. So that you are able to play a 4-drop 10 power card on 3, play a 4-drop 10 power card on 4, play a 4 or 5 on 5, and then have your Skaar discounted anyway. It's basically just worse version of Surtur, but I do think it ends up just a little bit more valuable than Iron Patriot, in part because of how on rails this deck already is. Why bother adding complications and wrinkles like Iron Patriot when you could just smooth everything out and have your free guy the best you can do with him? I have a little bit of suspicion that this deck is not necessarily going to be long for this world, but right now it is actually just genuinely quite solid. There is a lot that this deck has going for it, but the one dynamic I really want to point out with this deck is it is a deck that has a very powerful proactive game plan, and has paired that proactive powerful game plan with the card Mobius and Mobius. If you watched last week's video, the tier list, we talked about how the metagame was moving more towards Mobius and Shang as the tech cards of choice. This tier list certainly bears that out. You are going to see a lot of Mobius, you are going to see a decent amount of Shang as well. One of the major, I guess, macro archetypes in this game right now is good deck that can afford to run Mobius. Good deck that can just get that card in here is going to be a great spot for you to be in. Mobius has a lot of utility across matchups right now. It's excellent, of course, at making sure that Skaar doesn't actually cost 0. It can disrupt bullseye lines out of discard, making it so that the swarms cost 2 and are unable to be discarded by him. It's obviously extremely good against Mr. Negatif for reasons that I think are abundantly clear. Mobius is an excellently positioned card right now, and so there are a lot of decks like this that are taking advantage of the fact that, hey, we're in a Mobius Shang-Chi meta, I'm going to play a bunch of ongoings, none of my stuff is going to die to that stuff, and I am just going to have a bunch of big numbers, and it's going to be someone else's problem to deal with me. A bit of a throwback deck here. Husky Puppies messaged me like he had created this deck recently, and I pointed out that it was the exact same as something we were running about 4 weeks ago, and he was like, Oh, well, it's 2 cards different, so in fairness, he is right, he changed 2 cards. Shout out to Husky Puppies inventing this archetype. But, like, jokes aside, this is an archetype people are and should be familiar with. This is the V-Hand deck from week 1 of V-Hand with Misery, right? Why is it good now? I think the adaptation that was actually made here that is worth talking about is dropping Luke Cage for Shadow King, because that covers the same anti-venom base, but also gives you relevant tech. This is also a deck that is another entry in the deck that can afford to run Mobius happens to run Mobius. Absolutely going to happen. Now, I was trying Moonstone in this list, but I realized I think that A, pretty expensive, B, basically never playing it, so I ended up swapping it for Juggernaut, because Juggernaut manages to be a good card with Iron Patriot, but also a good card after an anti-venom, and those are not a lot of cards fit those criteria, right? Like, it's basically just the 2 that we have in the deck, maybe Red Guardian, maybe Rocket and Groot, maybe Cassandra Nova, but like pretty much if you're looking for a 3-drop that is good off of an anti-venom and also good with an Iron Patriot, you're kind of just stuck on Speed and Juggernaut as your options, and so those are the ones that I'm running. I actually had a ton of success with this list. It seems very well suited to what this current metagame is about, and it's just a generally strong mid-range shell that is worth talking about in the context of being able to support a sort of ecosystem of its own, right? We talk about a lot of mid-range shells in the context of like, here's the Ajax deck, here is the Wiccan deck, and I think it might be worth taking a look at this core of cards and thinking of it in the same terms as like the Wiccan deck, the Ajax deck. This is something that I think might have longevity. Not necessarily the specifics of the tech choices here, but this sort of deck with tech choices could be a relevant metagame player for a while. Next up is Scream, who encompasses several different ranges right now, but again, this is just a very straightforwardly understandable deck. It does good things, it does them in confusing ways, and it just got a new tool in the form of Sam Wilson, which means that it has other good 2-drops to draw that aren't just Scream. Not only is Sam good, he also ends up making Craven better, which means that this deck is able to put more points on the board in the early game with regularity, and then back that up with disruption and points in the form of the final cards in the deck. Cards like Cannonball and Stegron and Arrow. These are relevant to making sure that your opponent's game plan does not go as planned. You can also try getting a Mobius in here. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on Mobius versus Shang here. I think either one would be acceptable. The thing with Scream, though, is now it is a very full deck. We talk about good deck that can run Mobius, right? Like, that is a little harder in this deck than it used to be. There's a lot of cards that all sort of go in this deck, especially with the addition of Sam to it. There's not as much space as you would otherwise have. I feel like there's something here when I play this deck. It's definitely not like it's been bad, but it's also like I feel like there's something here, and then there are these draws where you're like playing off curve the entire game because you drew one card one turn late, but it's still the right thing to do, like play your 2-drop on 3 type stuff. There's just a bunch of really weird and awkward things that would be alleviated by running more 1-drops or like a Kate Bishop, but you can't because you can't get those cards in the deck because this is such a very jam-packed hybrid. You're not able to really run tech either, but what this deck does do is have massively powerful nut draws that just put a ton of points on the board, although I do think long-term it is a little more gimmicky than either the base Scream or the base Skaar deck. It is a functional combination of the two and gets a lot of value out of the confusion you can generate by final turn Heimdall versus Magneto. Very difficult to play around both. The last of the Scream decks is, of course, Scream 2099. Now, I am not gonna get on anyone's case here, especially because I'm like 95% sure that this is like the exact list that I made when this stuff came out. So if I'm getting on anyone's case here, it's probably my case. But this deck is so face up. Like, it is just remarkably, insanely face up. Your opponent knows exactly what you're doing. Exactly everything that you are going to do is face up. You have maybe 2 mix-ups in the entire deck, and it's just which 6-drop am I playing? And it's like, well, they're going to play around Doom every time anyway, and you probably are playing Doom because that's what Doom 2099 says on it, right? Like, what? You're going to turn down the 24 power Doom? I don't think so. And so the deck is just like the world's most face-up obvious thing, especially when it's doing well. And that gives it awkward snap dynamics, similar to the big points ongoing deck, actually. Although I do think it has, like, on average, maybe a few less points. But, you know, no vulnerability to stuff like Enchantress in the same way that those decks are vulnerable to it. This is a deck that has some reasonable points, but not incredible points, and it's sacrificing basically the ability to ever surprise its opponent with anything of all time. I've been playing the same damn Arishem list for God knows how long and changing like 2 or 3 cards every 3 weeks, and guess what? That's the same. I have now geniusly swapped out Red Guardian for Mobius. One of the interesting things about like how you can sort of track how metagames are going is keep an eye on the tech slots in Arishem, right? Like you can actually sort of glean information from that. Last week we had a Shang in it. Before that, we had an Enchantress in it. Last week we had a Red Guardian in it. Now we have a Mobius in it. So like you can see this deck actually growing and shifting and changing all the way back to when before we had Ares in it, we had Killmonger, Lady Deathstrike. There's like 2 slots in every Arishem deck that are basically reserved for whatever the most relevant thing you can do about what everyone else is doing. And so this is actually like kind of a teachable moment, I think, when you talk about what this deck is and what this deck does. Look at those last 2 slots, and then you'll see what you should be valuing and think about why those things make sense. Right now, you know, Mobius has a ton of targets. Shang has a bunch of targets. There's a lot of people playing hybridized Scream and Surtur decks. There's just a lot of things that are pretty big. But I do think that of the 2, the more important right now is Mobius. I think there was a lot of reasonable fear about discard becoming a truly elite deck. But a lot of this stuff, like why Shang and Mobius are relevant right now, is driven by discard. Throw priority, Shang their big guy. Have a Mobius, they can't make that guy big. And so this is sort of, I won't say it's like patient zero of this metagame, but the metagame started shifting towards being a Shang Mobius metagame basically the second they nerfed move bounce and left this deck as sort of the reigning large numbers deck of the metagame. And so that's a reasonable thing to consider. Another card that actually took a hit from that, and this is sort of tangential though, is Red Guardian, who there is just much less of, right? People got to get Mobius in their deck somehow, and he is often a casualty of that. And now that people aren't playing a bunch of Madam Web, it's actually a lot worse to be playing Red Guardian. Not bad, of course, but a little bit worse. And so you see this deck actually gaining some ground back, even though the metagame is sort of moving in a direction that runs counter to it. This deck has the best nut draws in the entire game. If you are drawing well with this deck, if you are getting lucky, if you are getting things happening your way, you will be completely untouchable. Your numbers will be so much bigger than everything else. It will not even come close. It will not matter. Nothing matters. Your numbers are huge. You are doing gigantic things. There are going to be like 30 power dudes on the board. That's a very difficult thing to beat. You are a little bit more interactable with than Move Bounce was, though, for example, and that is a relevant weakness. And that weakness is currently one that the metagame is sort of aimed at. I don't know exactly where this deck came from, but it sort of came out of nowhere to be a very highly played deck at Top Infinite as a consequence, in my opinion, of once Bounce, specifically Move Bounce, but even normal Bounce, becomes a smaller part of the metagame, it is much easier to just be like, what if I ran every tech card? And this is a shell that enables you to run every tech card. That's pretty much the only thing that's going on here, right? Like, this is a fine, solid, reasonable deck. It is a good deck, I would say, because you have all the answers for what people are doing. Oh, look, I'm an ongoing deck. Wrong, Enchantress. Oh, look, I'm making big guys. Wrong, Shang-Chi. Here's the thing, though. Like, it's just light on numbers. There are numbers in this deck, but when you look at the numbers that other decks do, even on like some medium draws, you start to realize that this deck is going to be very dependent on actually hitting with the tech cards. This is not a deck that is putting 30 points of power in any lane ever at all. And so it is a deck that needs the tech cards to be relevant if it is going to be able to keep up with stuff. And that means that this is a deck that can exist and does exist and is pretty good, but also that it is going to feel bad when you are playing for 4 cubes against the deck that dies to Enchantress and she's just on the bottom of your deck. That's a real thing, and it's unfortunately the kind of thing where you're just like, oh, well, guess they got me. It's a good deck. I don't want to sit here and act like it isn't, but it is sort of fundamentally reactive, and it needs those reactive tools to matter if you want to actually win games. For the Magic players among you, I think Mill is sort of the Jund of this format, and I don't mean from when Jund was good. I mean this is the 48% win rate deck, but a really consistent 48% win rate of the format. You are just doing, this is the most generic good cardsy deck that has ever existed. You're taking some real heat from Mobius mattering in the context of this, where you're just like, oh god, my death is actually 8. And you were kind of predicated on that. There's some argument towards going towards a Lady Deathstrike just to answer that Mobius stuff. I think that is worth considering right now, where it previously probably was not worth considering at all. But one of the other things that really hurt about this deck is that its best matchup is basically gone forever now for reasons I can't exactly explain. Clog is just not a thing anymore. I mean, I guess it's not actually for reasons I can't exactly explain. This deck is why. It's just it has hated all of its good matchups out of the metagame, and now it's just left with a deck that goes way taller than it and blanks the tech cards. When you play this into the ongoing deck, you're just oh, I don't have cards. If I'm not getting this death out there, I don't have numbers in my deck that can beat what they're doing. I don't beat a Psylocke Doom 2099. I just don't do that. I don't beat it. And so there's this incredibly awkward moment for Mill where it's Mill was good as a deck because the suite of tech cards that it basically has to run in part of the Fenris package, right? The suite of tech cards that it basically is obligated to run, like Shang-Chi, like Killmonger. We were in a metagame where that stuff was relevant. And now we're going into a metagame where it's a little less relevant, and people are playing tech that's good against you. And so this is a deck that goes from being medium plus, maybe above 50% win rate, to medium minus, where it's I don't think there's a good reason to play this deck right now. It's fine, but I would avoid it if I were you. But I have to talk about it here because it's still popular, and I think that is Jund. It's cool. Jund is cool. People just playing the deck that they know, and it's consistent and it does stuff. And then sometimes you get ruthlessly blown out by anyone who can go over the top of you in a reasonable way. The best kept secret in Marvel Snap is that this deck is still really damn good. It's a little scary, honestly, because I really don't want people to figure it out, but I am obligated to talk about it. The only thing that's keeping it this far down on the tier list is that just not a lot of people are playing it, and I think that's something that I'm intensely grateful for. The dynamics that this deck creates, the sort of specific ways in which you have to go about teching for it with cards like Ghost and Invisible Woman, in my opinion, put too much undue pressure onto the kind of decks that would be trying to beat it, make mid-range decks have to play multiple slots devoted to this specific matchup. I think it sucks, and I hope this deck is forever consigned to the bowels of wherever decks go when people just forget that they're good. Speaking of a deck that people just forgot that it was good entirely, I have zero clue how this deck is not being played right now in a world where people are unironically Doom 2099 ongoing-ing you. Like, people think that teching for ongoing is like about Enchantress and Rogue and stuff like that. It's like, no, dude, if you're a US Agent Red Guardian deck with Hazmat and Ajax, you're gonna beat the hell out of that matchup. You're gonna do horrendous, awful things to that poor little Doom 2099, and like, nobody's playing this. I have no idea. Like, it doesn't make sense. I guess it's like because of the Mobius stuff. You're just like, I don't want to be a Mobius gamer right now, but I don't want to be an anti-venom gamer right now. But I don't think there's enough Mobius yet to force you to make that decision. Like, this is just like, I am like, this feels like a really strong deck right now, to be blunt, that almost literally nobody is playing. And like, there is absolutely something to be done with US Agent in a world where people are playing a bunch of unironic Doom 2099, get that out there and count on that to win the game. Like, that card's just gonna be like 15 power. And it's just like, yeah, you should probably like play the deck that lets you do that. Do you remember the thing I literally just said about US Agent? Here's another deck that can play US Agent. There you go. That's the deck, right? Like, we're doing our US Agent thing. Like, again, this is like a sort of bounceless bounce, pseudo bounce deck. The real thing that this deck can have some issues with is like just anything that can go way taller than it. But you have a lot of inbuilt answers to a decent amount of that stuff. Like, people don't want to talk about it, but you know US Agent is like really good at making sure Skaar doesn't actually get discounted, right? Like, it's really good at that too. And I also think you could even try getting a Mobius in here for that Red Guardian, maybe for that Cosmo. Like, that's the kind of thing where it's like, this deck has real room to grow, I think. It's just a really powerful shell that I think is generally pretty underrated, and maybe doesn't get sort of the shine that it deserves. But this is another one of those, like, this is a customizable shell that can sort of morph and change with the metagame. Although I do think it's a little less customizable than, say, the Victoria Hand shell. There is something to be said for just like this kind of deck always being pretty close to being a really good deck most of the time it's been around. Mr. Negative is sort of falling into a spot where it is not perhaps the greatest choice right now. A lot of that is, we've talked a lot about Mobius during this, but also this is a deck that is very good and sort of exists on a razor's edge. The fundamental premise of Mr. Negative is that, yeah, you'll have like a 45% win rate, but you'll make up for it in guaranteed wins and easy snaps. If people are playing Mobius, they get to flip that on you, and it really just sucks. It is just awful. You get gutted. And like, some percentage of your games that previously were not involving this card, now let's say 15% of the metagame is running Mobius, that means like you have a much greater chance at just getting your snap reversed on you and losing instantly. And that is really bad. Mr. Negative's premise, like, he exists on such a thin margin where if you are not converting your snaps, he is not a deck that is worth playing. And right now, those margins are definitely being attacked. Sera Control is actually like a little bit interesting because there are actually decks right now where it's just like, oh yeah, this is kind of nice. There's a bunch of good stuff that happens here. There's a lot of decks playing like Hood stuff with Killmonger under a Ghost being like legitimately great against that. There's a lot of decks that are vulnerable to either Shang or Ench. You get to play Mobius in here. A lot of strong cards. Problem, other people also play Mobius. Horrifying concept for you. And so I always sort of feel like Sera, whatever goals Sera is trying to achieve, are usually better achieved in some other shell, running a smaller amount of tech and a greater amount of engine. There's this concept that I've been thinking of in Yu-Gi-Oh! Recently where it's like non-engine cards, and I think that can be instructive in Marvel Snap, where it's like we look at a deck that is like this. This is just like playing all interactive hand traps or whatever. And that can be right some of the time, but a lot of the time you want some amount of engine and then your interaction to cover for things. And your engine is there to give you a higher floor. Whereas with Sera Control, the floor here is so low. It is just like an absolute garbage deck compared to any other deck if the tech cards aren't hitting. It's really bad in terms of just baseline point output. If like they also have a Mobius, or you don't convert on your Iron Patriot or anything like that. It's not like the worst thing ever, but there's not a lot of decks on this list that in a normal game are going to output fewer points than Sera. As always, I am legally obligated to remind you that I cannot physically stop you from playing Destroy. I can tell you that it's not a great idea, but I cannot stop you. You are free to do this. It's fine. I have nothing against the deck. You are legally allowed to play this deck. There is nothing in the law yet that says you can't. Much like the Department of Education, it exists in a sort of nebulous legal space where maybe it's not real, but maybe it is. Last few decks are Cooks by Infinite Friends of Mine, and this one's actually mine. I'm just going to pat myself on the back a little bit because I don't necessarily think this is super representative, but at top 50% Infinite, this exact 12 cards is the only Joaquin Torres deck with more than 50 games played that has a positive win rate. You're welcome. This is, of course, the build of Joaquin Torres that I got to after working with Crazy's deck. It's like a super meaningless stat because the sample size is still really small, but I will pat myself on the back for at least preliminarily, I did get to the best Joaquin Torres deck. Go me. This comes from a high infinite friend of mine named Rainemann. It is, of course, a Thanos list, and one of the things I've really noticed about this deck is that when you are rolling downhill, Mind Stones on turn 1, stuff like that, you are a deck that has a ton of relevant solutions to a lot of what the metagame has to offer. You have multiple ways of dealing with powerful things that your opponents are doing. You have Valkyries that can deal with the Skaar stuff happening right now. You have Red Guardian. There's a bunch of strong stuff. And once you start rolling downhill, you basically, like, as you draw through your deck with the stones, you end up having, like, so many more options than other people. You have baseline ability to interact with your opponent. You have free Mockingbirds. The problem is when you aren't rolling downhill with this deck, you are just a worse version of every other deck. You are just worse at doing things than everything else. And it's like, I don't necessarily love what's going on here, but I get it. And what it's trying to do is roll downhill, and when it does, it's amazing, and when it doesn't, yeah, but like there are very few other shells that can accommodate all this sort of wide range of problem solving. It's just there are going to be games where it doesn't matter how wide your range of problem solving is because your hand is like fully unplayable garbage. This is a build of Tempo Pile by Derek. He is a connoisseur of tempo piles. It's just like the thing that he does. Just puts together like various 12 card good cards, all sort of small, with like one card anchoring it all. It used to be Elsa, now it's Galacta. And this is sort of another, not necessarily attempt to answer everything, but it's like, you know, the old Noki decks, the Loki-less Loki, where it's just, we want to have a bunch of different tools, and our job is combining the tools in a powerful and reasonable way to deal with what our opponent is outputting. It benefits extremely heavily from high levels of metagame knowledge, because you need to know what your opponent is doing in order to understand what your plays are supposed to be. Very difficult deck to play, if only because of that. Alright, y'all, normally that would bring me to the end of the video, but there is an omission on this tier list that I want to discuss. That's Wiccan. I don't necessarily think Wiccan is unplayable. Much in the same way that something like Silver Surfer can go off of a tier list just because people aren't really playing it right now, I think Wiccan has sort of hit that point, where like this card is good, and it is the kind of thing that is worth doing generally, but at the top end of Infinite, I kind of think it just falls short a little more often than not. It has similar vibes in my mind to Mill, where it's just like this very straightforward Jund style deck that exists. I want to be clear though, I don't think Wiccan is bad. I think Wiccan is good. I just don't think he's suited for the metagame as it's developing. The more tech card heavy things are, the harder it is to be a Wiccan deck, because you are built on being a deck that needs to be able to play proactively. The more you're playing stuff like Mobius and Shang-Chi especially, the harder it gets to be a deck like that. You can do it, but there are other things that might be a little bit better. And so that's really the space that I find Wiccan in, where it's not like the card is bad, it's not like the decks are bad, but there's not a lot of reason for me to want to play it, and I find that a little bit, not necessarily sad or anything like that, because it's been a metagame force before, but it is notable to me. Like, this is a deck that is sort of the archetypal curve-out mid-range deck in Marvel Snap right now, and it's just so deeply mediocre because of the other decks in the metagame that are able to just absolutely go over the top of it with points and obliterate the crap out of it if you don't have the right tech. And so then you have to be a Wiccan deck that is playing reactive tech, and whenever reactive tech is required, you don't want to be doing that in the deck that is requiring you to curve out, because what if you have to play your Shadow King on two, right? Again, not bad. Not bad by any means. And I think this is also something I wanted to talk about, because I think people assume when stuff doesn't get on a tier list, it's because I think the deck is bad. It's not, more that they're just like more relevant stuff to talk about a lot of the time. And I wanted to be clear about that. Like, people shouldn't look at these lists and be like, these are the only decks I can play. Don't do that. That's ridiculous. I'm just a guy, okay? What if I'm wrong, As always, I've been KM Best. I am never wrong, and I will see you in the next one.